Hey guys, in this video we're going to be talking about how we built this Walnut printer riser. It's got a nice little modern base, mitered edge profile, and a nice little chamfered front. Gives it a nice clean, modern, simple look that I think is really cool. So if you guys stick around, hopefully you'll learn something. Starting off this project, we're going to be working on the base. And as with all projects, we start at the miter saw, chopping our rough lumber down to sizes that we can mill more easily. First stage in our milling process happens at the jointer, where we're going to face joint one face, and we're going to also reference the face we just jointed and edge joint one edge. From here we're going to move over to the planer. The planer references the face that we just jointed and removes the rough material from the opposite face. Next we move to the table saw, where we take the edge that we jointed earlier at the jointer and we rip along the rip fence. Our stock in this case is going to be square, so we're ripping square sized pieces, leaving us with our final dimensioned lumber. It's optional to edge joint between each rip to ensure a clean, flat edge. When ripping at the table saw, it's easy to leave some saw marks behind on the offcut piece. These can easily be cleaned up at the planer while also simultaneously squaring up your stock. So this is a great step for post-ripping. Now that our stock is squared up, we're moving back over to the table saw, where we're going to be using our crosscut table to cut to final length. This can also be done obviously at the miter station or by hand. You want to always make sure to cut one clean edge first and then cut to length at the opposite edge. In this case, we're cutting a bunch of angled cuts, as our modern base features 60-degree tapered legs. An easy way to improve the precision of your crosscuts is to use a stop block like you can see we have clamped here. This ensures that all my leg pieces are going to be the same height and that my final product will sit nice and square. When cross-cutting small pieces like this, it's really important to remember safety comes first, guys, so make sure you're keeping your hands plenty clear of the blade and that you're aware of the full stroke of your motion before you start your move. Now that we're finished cutting all of our base pieces to length, we're going to do our glue up for the base. We're using Type-On Quick and Thick here, as these are angled cuts and are mostly an end grain glue up. Quick and Thick is not only a thicker glue that dries quickly, but it also is much more strong in the end grain type glue up, as it's not as absorbed into the grain, so I highly recommend it for any end grain glue ups. While the outer portion of our leg assembly is dry, we're going to move over to milling lumber for our upper box. Again, we're using walnut here, and because we don't have pieces wide enough to do this all in one board, we're going to actually glue up a small panel before we start making our box. Per usual, we start at the jointer, where we transition from here to the planer. I use pencil marks here to make sure that these wider boards are planed all the way across. Because they're already slightly surfaced, it can be tricky to see if a certain area is a low spot and didn't get planed. And these pencil marks help identify that. When setting up to glue up my panels, I like to look at both the grain and the color to try to make as seamless a transition as possible. Although a multi-board glue up can look really, really cool and interesting, when it's small like this, I try to hide the fact that it's a glue up. Again, we're using Type-On Quick and Thick here, and we're not actually putting anything to reinforce this joint, because Type-On is plenty strong to hold the joint all on its own. If we were doing a multi-board glue up, we might use reinforcements more as a means of alignment tool, but in this case with the two-board glue up, it's not really an issue. While the panel for our box dries, we're going to move back over to the leg assemblies. Since we didn't use any sort of formal reinforcement on these joints, I'm going to go ahead and put a screw in just to add some mechanical reinforcement. The glue strength from Quick and Thick on these joints is probably strong enough, but it doesn't hurt to add a screw for reinforcements. To attach the center stretcher to our outer leg assemblies, we're going to be using dominoes, or floating tenons. You can do this with dowels, screws, biscuits, whatever you have available to you. And once again, we're using Type-On Quick and Thick here for our glue up, mainly just because this is such a simple glue up and speed is your friend. We want to be able to move back to this as quickly as possible, and Quick and Thick only requires clamp time of like 5 minutes, so definitely a fan for small projects like this. You'll notice I'm putting glue both in the mortises and on the tenons, as well as on the face of the boards that's going to be glued up. It doesn't hurt to have more glue than less, and this is such an easy part to clean up that a little bit of squeeze out's not a bad thing. While the base assembly finishes drying, we can move back over to the panel, which is now ready to come out of the clamps. You'll notice here I used a little bit of black CA glue from Starbond adhesives to fill in some of these cracks and knots. Starbond black CA glue not only looks really good with black walnut, but it also helps prevent cracks from spreading over time as the wood moves. As I prepare to cross-cut the miters for our box, it's time to square back up my sliding table saw fence. I use the largest square I have for this, which is my Woodpecker's 1812 square. Next, I set my blade to 45 degrees to cut my miters using my digital angle gauge, but you can also do this with a 45-degree square. I prefer to cut my miters using my sliding table, but if you don't have one, you can also use a track saw or a circular saw with an edge guide. In order to keep the same grain, color, and pattern to the outside, I marked here with sticky notes to make sure that I cut all my miters in the correct orientation. You'll also see that once again I'm using a stop block against my fence to make sure that I cut all my pieces to the same length. I use a spacer here to make sure that I don't trap the offcut piece between the blade and the fence. Now that we've cut all of our miters, it's time to glue up our box. Miter boxes like this are never fun to glue up, but I find using painter's tape makes pretty light work of it. The key is to use the tape basically like a clamp, stretching it nice and tight, pulling it into tension, which when you fold the box up will really pull those joints nice and snug. Due to the weakness of these miter joints, again, we're going to be using quick and thick, and making sure to apply a liberal amount of glue here. The last thing you want is a joint to fail because you didn't put enough glue in. Although it's not necessary for a light-duty box like this printer riser, it is worth noting that miter joints definitely benefit from things like splines, dominoes, biscuits, dowels, some form of reinforcement. We're not doing that here, but it's definitely a great option for pieces that require a stronger load. Although probably not necessary, we're adding some strap clamps here just to give it a little bit of extra squeeze on the joints. Moving back to our base assembly, we're going to drill some pilot holes for how we're going to attach the base to the top. Typically we wouldn't want to attach directly from the base to the top using screws because this prevents wood movement, but in this case it's a very narrow box and the amount of wood movement is going to be pretty insubstantial. So this is a great option to simplify the attachment method. Once our box is out of the clamps, it's time to move on to finish work. We're going to do a little bit of sanding, and we're actually using a screwdriver with a little bit of glue to burnish the mitered corners. This helps us close up any small gaps that may be left when our tape didn't get enough clamping pressure. Now that we've completed our build, it's time to move on to finishing. Here we're applying a water-based polyurethane using our Erlex HVLP sprayer. HVLP is a great option for finishing boxes like this because it can be tricky to get into small nooks and crannies like this box has on the inside. Now that our finish is dried, it's time to move on to attaching our base, which again we're just using 1 1/4 inch wood screws to attach. And just like that, she's done. This simple design took about 4 hours to do from start to finish, and honestly I'm really happy with how it turned out. Mitered corners make the grain look really great, and the simplicity of the design is just really awesome. If you guys stuck around for the whole video, it would mean a lot if you guys would give us a follow or a subscription. Thanks a lot, guys.